Okay, good morning and welcome everyone to this, the 17th meeting of 2012 of the European and External Relations Committee. I make the usual request that all mobile phones and electronic devices are switched off because they interfere with broadcasting. And we'll kick off with agenda item 1, which is the decision on taking business in private. This is to ask the committee to decide to take agenda item 5 in private as committee. Agreed with that. Thank you very much. Agenda item 2 is moving on to a much more substantive issue of consideration of a SPICE research paper on the EU Directive on Human Trafficking. Before I invite members to make their comments and maybe Ian to give us a bit of a briefing, you'll see from your papers that we have received a letter from a number of organisations who have an interest in this field, who have raised a number of questions. So hopefully we can address some of them today and take some of the ideas forward too. Ian, do you want to give us a wee brief oversight of your paper and then we'll go to members for questions?
Yeah, the paper, I was asked by the committee to look at the kind of context in terms of devolved issues, in terms of human trafficking. The paper kind of looks at that. Obviously, immigration and asylum are reserved to Westminster. But policies in these areas impact upon devolved responsibilities, such as access to health, education, social work, and obviously there's justice issues in there as well, which are devolved. The European Directive on Preventing Combating Trafficking in Human Beings and Protecting its Victims was passed in April 2011. The paper covers the main provisions in the directive. I don't propose to kind of go through those in whole, but it does identify the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring or reception of persons, including the exchange or transfer of control over those persons for the purpose of exploitation as a criminal offence. The directive also outlines penalties, which include at least a 5-year imprisonment or 10 years if there are aggravating circumstances in the event of this offence being committed. Finally, the directive also provides for assistance and support and protection for victims of human trafficking. The UK government, in terms of transposition of the directive, the UK government had initially indicated it was withholding its position and hadn't declared whether it wished to opt in to the directive or not. However, in March 2011, they announced that they would opt into the directive, and they are now making plans to ensure that England and Wales is compliant with the provisions provided for in the directive. In Scotland, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice in the Chamber in February this year indicated that he felt that the changes made in the Criminal Justice Licensing Scotland Act 2010 meant that Scotland was broadly compliant with the directive already. The Scottish Government has recently, in October this year, hosted a human trafficking summit, and at that summit the Government announced that a new statutory aggravation is to be introduced to make the perpetrators of human trafficking easier to prosecute. That's a brief summary of the paper, of what the paper covers.
Okay, thanks very much, Ian. Comments from members? Helen?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I think it's very helpful having had that briefing, and I certainly had not been aware of the Cabinet Secretary's views on that, but I gather from other informal discussions that committee members have talked about in our pre-meeting that the Cabinet Secretary's perhaps open-minded to considering what actions could be taken. But I mean, I think, personally speaking, I think the letter that we have received from the agencies who have written in is quite a powerful letter, because you've got probably 6 or 7 very important agencies across Scotland who focus specifically on the issues of human trafficking matters, and I know that you yourself you have told us about your involvement over a period of time. I have not had such an intensive experience, but I am persuaded by the letter that they have sent in that it does seem to me that despite the fact that Scotland seems to broadly comply with the requirements of the EU directive, it does seem that they've made quite a powerful case for arguing that something more specific should be done. So I suppose it's down to us as a committee to try to persuade the Cabinet Secretary that he should look again at this, because I think that the point that impressed me most of all in the letter that they've written is under paragraph 3 on page 2, where they're talking about the criminalisation and detention of potential victims of human trafficking, and they're saying there that Scotland cannot be said to be acting in the spirit of Article 8 of the EU directive laid out in the preamble of Article 14, whilst people, many of them under the age of 25, continue to be detained for activities they undertook linked to trafficking and their exploitation. So I think, they go on to talk about that, but then, the most compelling thing for me is, given that, we're in all these papers this morning informed about the fragmentation of existing law, I think it's quite compelling when we look at what Baroness Helena Kennedy QC recommended, and she's urging us as a Scottish Parliament to press the Scottish Government to consider introducing a comprehensive human trafficking bill based upon a review of all its legislation relating to human trafficking. So I certainly would support an approach like that and hope that the Cabinet Secretary would take that on board. And ultimately, I realise he's got huge pressures on him, and so understanding the difficulties he's got, and that the Justice Committee is very overwhelmed by work, I would be even, I sort of say that the committee ought to think about itself doing a committee bill in the absence of anyone else being willing to undertake it in Parliament. Obviously, it's better if one of the specialist committees undertakes that work. But given that there's a level of expertise, including your own round the table, then I don't think, and not just expertise, but enthusiasm, I think, by a number of us to tackle this issue, we ought to be disposed to keep a very open mind and be willing to work hard on the issue.
Okay, yeah, Helen, I take on board all of those comments. One of the things about the committee bill, we have to have a conversation with the Equal Opportunities Committee to see what their plans are. I know that the inquiry that I was involved in 2010, there's a provision in there to have a follow-up, a look back and see what's happened. On the issue of paragraph 3, you're absolutely right, there is concerns in there. One of the main concerns is that in Scotland we don't have control of the national referral mechanism. It's a UKBA that has control of that, and unless someone actually refers themselves or are referred by a first responder with evidence, then they're not deemed to be trafficked, and they're then convicted as either an illegal immigrant or they're convicted under other pieces of legislation, and there's actually no right of appeal for the NRM. So you've got UKBA officials making the decision on whether someone has been trafficked and someone's asylum status at the same time. So there's a real concern of a conflict of interest in there, and that's an issue that's been ongoing. You're absolutely right about my personal involvement in that, and probably at this stage of the meeting I should declare an interest in that. I am the co-convener of the cross-party group on human trafficking in the Scottish Parliament, so I should just make reference to that there's an interest outside of the committee for me on that. But you're absolutely right on all of those issues, and I think taking up some of the points with the Cabinet Secretary is the way to go. Any other comments from members? Rod Campbell?
Perhaps I ought to declare an interest as well as a member of the cross-party group on human trafficking. That was a very helpful briefing. I'm not quite sure what EU timetable is for the directive. You might want to comment on that in a minute. But just moving on, it's obviously we've had a very useful letter from Anne Hamilton and others dated the 10th of December. I would have thought that as a first step it would be helpful for the committee to formally refer this to the Scottish Government and invite their comments. There are a number of matters that are raised. My recollection of the Cabinet Secretary's comments at the end of February was in relation to the recommendation of Baroness Kennedy about a catch-all piece of legislation that he didn't rule it out, but there were a lot of priorities and parliamentary time was precious. So if there were ways of dealing with the issues of parliamentary time, that would seem advantageous. But I take on board what the convener has said about the Equal Opportunities Committee's remit in that, and obviously I think we need to investigate that further, but it's an important directive and it's an important topic and one that we need to take seriously.
Willie Coffey?
Thanks very much, Convener, and I welcome the briefing from Spice that we've just heard there. I think when we're talking about human trafficking, there's perpetrators of this, there's victims, but there's beneficiaries too. And my attention was drawn to whether within the directive there will be any proposals to target the beneficiaries of human trafficking who may profit from some of the activities that are going on. And the example in the paper that Spice has given us, of course, in areas where there's forced labour, those who profiteer from the delivery of services, goods and services perhaps, from using forced labour, I would hope the directive will cover this in some detail, if not at the moment, at some future stage. So I know in Scotland that we do have proceeds of crime legislation, but I'm unclear about what provisions may be within member states within the European Union to tackle this. So I think it's really the final loop that needs to be closed there to send a message loud and clear, Convener, that those who benefit and profit from human trafficking will be targeted also.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a very valid point too, and I've got the directive here, but it goes into pages and pages, so maybe getting a more in-depth look at that particular issue would be very helpful, yeah, Ian?
It's Article 7, actually. It requires member states to take the necessary measures to ensure that competent authorities are entitled to seize and confiscate proceeds from the offences referred to in Articles 2 and 3. And Rod asked about, member asked about the transposition. It's by April 2013. Member states are required to transpose the directive.
Would committee find it helpful to have an actual copy of the directive? I mean, because I need a lot of detail, but it's actually quite well laid out. You can find things quite easily in it. So, yeah, make sure members have got that. Hanzala Malik.
Thank you, Convener. As a citizen of Scotland, the United Kingdom and the EU, I find it quite challenging that we've got different legislation for different things pegged at different levels. And I think that's unhelpful. I think that, as Europeans, we really need to home in and focus in legislation so that, we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. I think the idea that, different parts of the European Union nitpick and cherry-pick legislation, I don't think is a comfortable position to be in. And the reason why I say that is I believe that there are far too many victims from that process. And we see examples of immigration in terms of immigrants trying to enter the United Kingdom from France via trucks, lorries and all sorts, and putting themselves at risk. But more importantly, in today's day and age, in terms of security, I think it's also very important that our borders are secure. So I think it's important that anybody that walks our streets needs to be able to identify themselves clearly of who they are and what they are and what they are about. And therefore, I think it really beggars belief that in this day and age, within the European Union, we still have different bits of legislation, and that really needs to change. And now, for us to suggest that, we ourselves in Scotland have good legislation, but we only need certain bits of legislation coming from Europe, I'm not sure whether that's the best position to be in. I think that I would really appreciate the Cabinet Secretary looking at this a little bit more clearly in terms of where do we actually want to go. Today in the streets of Glasgow, we see crime, for example. We are now seeing individuals being vanned around, driven around for begging spots. Car parks, banks, machines and shopping centres have beggars on them. And a lot of people are intimidated by them, yet we fail to deal with the issue. There is also prostitution, the victimization of people, vulnerable people. And therefore, I think the challenge is far more greater than sometimes we give credit for. And therefore, my suggestion really is that we really need to ask the European Union to try and come up with a system where we all have the same legislation so people are protected equally across Europe, and there are no safe havens for criminals within Europe.
Okay, thanks for that. Jimmy?
Yes, I'd like to thank Ian for his briefing on this. I think that the crux of the thing is whether the Scottish legislation is too piecemeal. And if that is the case, I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary, we should ask the Cabinet Secretary to really look into that. And if it is too piecemeal, then we should definitely encourage him to have a piece of new legislation that encompasses the issue.
Thank you. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. I kind of take a different view from my colleague Mr Malik in this, in that I don't think what we're doing is actually nitpicking pieces of legislation. What we're ensuring is that the directive is fully compliant within Scots law. And obviously we've had some discussion about whether that would be best done through a bill in that area, or whether we should look to shoring up different bits of legislation to ensure we're fully compliant. And I also think we need to stress that this isn't just a matter of illegal immigration. You know, trafficking is a much more complex crime, and it involves legal entrance to the UK as well. So we can't sort of underestimate and sort of pigeonhole the level of organised crime that's involved in this. With the timescales that have already been mentioned, with being compliant by 2013, I think that from the Spice briefing, particularly in the area of the assistance and support and protection of victims, where it specifically mentions children and access to education, and also the section on prevention, which talks about training officials, I think that this is very relevant to the Children's Services Bill that's coming through, and I think that the committee should be informing the Children's Service Bill, and as that goes through for scrutiny, making sure that the directive is taken due notice of in that process as well.
I'm not strictly suggesting that people are cherry picking. What I'm really trying to identify is that Scots law in its own place is a robust piece of legislation. However, that said, we are also part of the European Union, and therefore any legislation that is passed in the European Union affects us directly or indirectly. And therefore, if we are going to be challenged by the European Union, we need to make sure that we are robust enough to be able to face up to that challenge. And our law lords need to know as well, in terms of when they're dealing with cases, it's not just simply about Scots law. I mean, traditionally, most European countries have good, tried and tested legislation, and that's fantastic. I think, but things have moved on, unfortunately, and people are usually uncomfortable about change. But change, nevertheless, is in the air, and in terms of European Union. And all citizens within the European Union are protected primarily by the European Union legislation now. It has superseded state law, and therefore I think it's important that we are more focused in terms of, and yes, of course, in terms of protection of children, protection of vulnerable people. Absolutely right that we focused in and homed in on that. However, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, it is part and parcel of our immigration policy, because that also affects this, because it depends on how we treat people in terms of freedom of movement and what rights they may or may not have. And that's where the European Union comes in, and that's where the European Union legislation comes in, and that's where I think that we need to look for guidance from the European Union itself in terms of how best to actually have a legislation which is exactly the same throughout Europe. So there are, as I've already indicated, no safe havens, no areas within the Europe where people can prey on others, and I think that's an important issue.
Okay, Rod Campbell.
I think it might be helpful if Ian actually just kind of gave us a bit of an overview of the status of an EU directive and what we're trying to achieve.
An EU directive allows greater flexibility for implementation within the member state. You'll be aware that an EU regulation is primary law that simply becomes law the moment it is signed off. A directive gives greater freedom to the member state to implement it compliant with existing legislation. And it can justify, as long as it can justify compliance, then it is compliant with that law as it comes in. So this is a directive. It allows the UK and it allows Scotland to determine how best to implement the objectives of the proposals to achieve the ambition, but it gives great freedom as to how it can be done, and each member state is entitled to do that in the way that it deems appropriate, as long as it is fully compliant with the ambition of the directive.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach?
No, it is not. No.
So we're trying to clarify that for your benefit.
Okay, thanks for that. I think that we have given this a lot of coverage this morning, in as much as there's lots of questions that we've asked, so we need a number of answers. I think if committee are minded to do so and minded to support the letter that came from the organisations, I would suggest we formulate a letter on the basis of all the questions in this to the Cabinet Secretary. Yeah. And if Ian could maybe do a wee bit further digging on some of the actual specific points that members have raised. And I think to maintain our good working relationships with our other committees, we should alert the Justice Committee and Equal Opportunities Committee that we may be looking at this further, just to ensure that we're maintaining our friendships and our relationships there. Is there anything else that you think, Ian, we should take forward at this point, or are... Helen?
Sure that each of those people that you've mentioned gets an actual copy of the letter from the organisations as well, because I think that would be quite helpful for them to see the context of our discussions this morning.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that Anne Hamilton emailed me quite late last night to make sure that all members had a copy of it, and I think maybe they'll be looking in to see what decisions we make. But you're absolutely right. If the letter that we have from the committee going forward to the Cabinet Secretary, once that's off to the Cabinet Secretary, we could certainly share that with the organisation so they know what line of inquiry we're taking. Claire?
Could I suggest we also write to the Education and Culture Committee, given the Children's Services
Absolutely, absolutely. Jimmy?
The letter we've received, which was on our desk this morning, we haven't really discussed that in any detail, because there are a lot of other questions in there, apart from the, you know, to do with guardianship and things like that. I mean, but this letter will be going to the sent to the Scottish Government, will it, for their comments?
The proposal that I made is to look at all of the issues. I mean, I think that there's 6 sections in the letter, then a few points at the end, and I think that those questions should formulate the basis of our letter to the Cabinet Secretary. We include a copy of this and ask for comment, guidance and advice on all of the points raised in the letter. Then we can bring it back to committee and decide what lines of inquiry we want to pursue further, or what line of direction we want to pursue. Is that okay? Yeah. Is committee content to do that then? Yes. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Ian. I'm just giving you some more work. Okay, moving on to agenda item 3, which is our Brussels Bulletin, and we have our European Officer Ian Duncan here, who will talk us through the Brussels Bulletin. Ian.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, let me just begin at the beginning. Again, as per usual, the biggest section is on the developments in the Eurozone. What I've tried to do here is pick up some of the strands which the committee were interested in at the last meeting, and Willie, you were talking again in some detail about the Credit Ratings Agency. So what I've done here is I've put in a section detailing what's going on right now with regards to credit rating agencies, and also a wee bit of background on page 3 as just to how they got to where they are now. So worthwhile having a little look in there. You'll see again at the top of page 2 in the second column some of the features that the EU would like to bring in to try and regulate credit ratings agencies. But I would just draw your attention to the quote from Moody's at the bottom, which I think has an ominous overtone. While we fully support the G20 agenda on credit ratings, we had expressed significant concerns about the potential market ramifications of some of the proposed policy measures. They're clearly not happy. So that's the best thing to say there. In terms of banking union, again, the meeting actually that took place finished at dawn last night. So there appears to be a proto-agreement on banking union. A compromise, again, had to be brokered between the French and the Germans. You'll recall the Germans did not want their smaller banks regulated. The French are very keen for all to be regulated. It seems now that somewhere between those two is the compromise. The smaller German banks will not be in the first instance, and they will come back and consider whether it's appropriate later on. I put in, almost just for, I suppose for my own amusement, the stop press item there, that in these negotiations you sometimes find odd things happening. And one of the big discussions to try and seemingly buy off the French was to suggest that they would get the headquarters of the agency taking this forward. So again, in these negotiations, everything's up for grabs. A couple of things just in terms of Greece. Again, Greece is now going to receive its money on the 13th of December. Again, one rather ominous note. The Greek economy has now shrunk 25% in the last 5 years. Something to note. Situation in Italy, somewhat unexpectedly, the party of the former Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi has withdrawn support from Mario Monti. Mario Monti has declared he will now stand down. Exactly when, unclear, but likely to be February. You already see the markets are very perturbed by that. The EU is very uneasy about what this will mean. Watch this space. Lots will happen in that regard. A consultation on electricity generation is worth just noting as well, which is in a little bit at the back. Closing date on the 7th of February 2013. This is covering how electricity is generated and capacity. Following on again from Helen Eadie's interest in state aid, I've put in again some of the work which is going on right now in state aid. Helen, this is just the beginning. You'll get a bigger paper in the new year touching on some of the other stuff. I thought as a starter for 10, this would show you where things now stand. And the final point, the alcohol pricing, I'm sure you'll have read in the papers where that now is. There is a link here at the second paragraph in column 2 on page 6, which gives you the full text of the opinion should you wish to read that. So that is there too. I'm happy to take questions on any part of the paper.
Comments, questions? Rod?
Just really a request of any further information. In terms of the negotiations which were ongoing last night, was anything touched on kind of the future programme for banking union?
Yes. I was reading this quite early this morning and trying to find out the information, as you'll appreciate. They're trying to set together a timetable. They still believe that if the heads of state and government are able to sign it off at the council meeting, at the summit coming up, then it should still be implemented at the beginning of the year. That would be the first step in the sequence. The bigger issue you'll recall is the tension between those within the Eurozone and those out with the Eurozone. There seems to be a greater agreement on that at the moment, but whether that agreement holds through the Council meeting coming up remains to be seen. That could easily upset the timetable. But I'll be able to provide more information when I've read the paper more thoroughly. It was a cursory romp through it this morning.
This whole area is one which is going to be of high political significance in the months ahead. So.
Okay, any further comments? Jamie?
Just basically, the Euro group, which is the group of 17 Euro users, I see the President standing down from that. Is that group, I noticed it has its meetings a month before the official EU meetings. How much influence does that group have on those meetings? And do they hold their meetings openly or are they in secret?
Very few groups in Brussels hold their meetings openly, and if they do hold them openly, they tend to have the discussions before the meeting. So in answer to that, no, they're not very open. It's a very influential group because it brings together the financial ministers of the Eurozone countries. So on any issues connected with the Eurozone, they will have the most important voice. The UK and other non-members of the Eurozone have observer status at these meetings, so they can participate on an invited basis and can be aware of what is being discussed. But the meetings always take place, as you'll be aware, the day before the formal meeting of the European finance ministers, or usually just about the day before. It's an influential body. It's the most influential body probably at the moment on the Eurozone and one of the most influential now in the whole financial area.
The President of the Eurogroup is the closest thing we have to the President of Europe, isn't it?
Well, he's a man who controls the big bag of money, which I think is quite influential in itself. You'll be aware that, yes, Jean-Claude Juncker is the Prime Minister of Luxembourg. So the influence of a very, very small state is very, very large. It's interesting.
Interesting. Willie, coffee?
Thanks, Convener. I don't wish to let the committee think that I'm pursuing some kind of vendetta against credit rating agencies, but I'm really interested in the points that Ian put in the report there. And I must say, it did come as some surprise to learn that some of these agencies can, in fact, have shares in the companies that they rate. I'm kind of astounded at that, to be perfectly honest with you, Convener and members. But I am pleased to see in the report there that in January coming that the European Parliament will legislate to regulate these agencies so that these kinds of practices cannot happen, or at least they're controlled. And I'm not surprised when Ian made the comment there that one of the agencies are not particularly happy about the proposed measures. But they've been in existence for such a long time, but have only come to public attention, I think, since the economic and the banking crisis. So I'm quite amazed that there was never any regulation of these agencies up until now, but nevertheless I'm pleased to see that it's coming.
Thank you very much. Helen?
to share the views that Willie's just expressed, and I think that one of the points that I picked up on was the fact that no rating agency may hold more than 10% shares in any entity they rate. That really struck me as being something that I hadn't thought about that angle, and that's a huge influence on the way money moves right across the globe. So that's something that's also to be welcomed, the fact that there will be limitations on that. And I think it's not an unimportant point that Dr. Duncan makes when he talks about European Central Bank being located in France, because that's exactly, and you have to admire the French for the speculative building. I mean, after all, they built the Palace of Europe in Strasbourg before there was even agreement as to where the Parliament was going to be located. So, all the time they seem to get in there on the act, and we really have got something to learn from the French in that regard, because that brings massive employment, massive construction opportunities and all the rest of it to Scotland. But I think that one of the other points was on the broadband, and I am absolutely in agreement with Willie Coffey on this issue. That's such an important issue right across Europe, and I gather that although financial support of 1.5 billion is coming to the UK, I mean right across Europe there's 28 billion has been earmarked for that, and so that's really powerful money, and it just underlines how critically important this is for the more rural parts of Europe. And so I welcome any developments on that, and be glad to be kept updated on how that is rolling out, because that will bring employment opportunities too. And the other point that has been highlighted is on the state aid, and although there's the big, more general review that's taking place, what I was specifically concerned about at our last meeting was the powers of officials without recourse to the elected representatives to be able to change the state aid rules in a way that is going to hugely impact on areas like Scotland. And I think I've circulated to all members of the Parliament a letter that I've written to Commissioner Almunia, to reflect my concerns on this, because it just simply means that you will no longer have the Avivas or the Amazons and all the rest of it if these rules are changed, which they are likely to be changed next week. That is the deadline we have. So unless my colleagues around the table take really urgent action on this, and I look to you, Convener, as well, to impress on your colleagues in government with the Cabinet Secretary, who I've already had a meeting with on this matter and urged her to take action on this, it will mean that Scotland will no longer enjoy the special category under Category C of the regional state aid, and that is something that will lose huge employment opportunities through that. So it's not unimportant, and I hope that colleagues will pick up on the email that I circulated to them just yesterday. And I think that's fine for them. Oh, no, the one last point that I was really interested to read, and as you rightly point out, we have all picked up in the newspapers over the last week, was the issue about the minimum pricing for alcohol. And it does seem like, well, it's very clear in the papers that we've had that the UK government is being urged to ensure that the legislation doesn't proceed, because obviously it's the member state that would be answerable in this instance on minimum alcohol pricing, and they're saying that it would be possibly the language that they counter this in is all sort of like very legalistic, very cautious, but they are suggesting that it would be against the competition rules and would create market distortions. So that's something that we said all the way through, and certainly for my part, when I spoke in the committee and in Parliament on this, was the unintended consequence they're talking about of the law would be a boost in profits for supermarkets and retailers. So in effect, government policy will put money into the pockets of retailers and supermarkets.
Rod?
Could I just comment on that last point? Again, Ian might be able to help us, Ian Duncan. I'm not sure. I thought it was under the impression, it's not in the bulletin itself, that the UK government was supportive of the Scottish government's position. So whilst Helen might make these points, I think the UK government is at one with the Scottish government on this. But
the UK government has stated it would support the Scottish government position. It closely mirrors its own position. And so it is seeking to contest. They're in a dialogue with the Scottish Government to find how best to take that forward. Again, the 27th of December, we shall find out what submission has been made by the UK and the Scottish Government.
It's taken, though, hasn't there, by the whisky distillers, and so that's in Brussels at the moment, I understand. So, you know, a lot will hinge on that outcome.
Yes,
so legal cases from members of the alcohol and tobacco industry, drugs industries don't always succeed, though, Helen.
Oh, it's just on that point. I'm slightly confused. The Secretary-General has written to the UK Government outlining the concerns of the Commission with regards to the Scottish Government proposals and recommends the UK abandon the current proposals. Is that the UK's proposals or the Scottish proposals? I mean, I'm slightly...
Yes, I see what you mean. Sorry, that may be my fault. What has happened is because the Scottish Government's proposals are further advanced than the UK Government's proposals, these proposals from Scotland have been considered by the Commission Secretary-General, and those are the ones which are being discussed. But as you'll be aware, the UK Government is responsible for, in this instance, the Scottish Government's particular policy. It must be an advocate for that. Yeah. The reason why the UK Government is very supportive is it mirrors exactly their own proposal for minimum pricing, and so it's likely that both governments will be on the same page when it comes to the position they put to the Commission authorities. But it just so happens that Scotland was quicker and it's more advanced in its proposals.
Right. So they're actually asking them to abandon, the UK Government to abandon the Scottish proposals, is that right?
Because it's a member state.
Yes, in a sense, the UK, yes. I know that sounds an odd way of putting it, but because the Scottish Government is part of the UK authority, if you like, in that regard, the UK is being invited to not go forward with this proposal. The internal mechanism for doing so will be more complicated, I imagine. But.
Thank you.
Claire Adamson.
It was just to reiterate a couple of the points. I mean, I think what my colleague Rhoda Campbell said about the cases that have come against the Scottish Government, obviously when there is a significant health issue like the one this week in the display of cigarettes, you know, the health issue was upheld. And I think we have to remember that the competition rules were always there, we were always aware of them, and the exception to that was always about the health benefits, so it hasn't changed where we are at the moment. It's still an issue of health benefit that's going through.
The test that Catherine Day is touching upon is that on balance of evidence, the evidence provided by the UK Government, the Scottish Government, is not adequate to justify the particular proposal. That's why it's more difficult, because at the moment, Catherine Day has assessed the evidence. So what I suspect will now have to happen is either further evidence or a greater depth of evidence has to be supplied in order to justify the distortion in the market on the basis of what will be the health grounds. So that will be the test.
That there's a full text of the opinion that we can click on the page to actually get the detail. But just to respond to Rod's point, I mean, the reality is that in the Netherlands a case was taken about state aid rules, and in that instance the European Commission found that it was anti-competitive when it was regards to the gin industry, and so it was not allowed. And so we could find ourselves in the same position. We may or we may not. It will just, I mean, the European Union does have a policy on alcohol itself, so it will depend if it fits into the overall alcohol policy that the European Union has.
Okay, Willie Coffey.
Very briefly on the same issue, Convener, what I've never understood about the whole argument about this unintended consequence of providing a boost in profits for supermarkets and retailers. On the surface of it, you can understand it, but my understanding of it is if the policy works and we fully expect that it will work, then it doesn't deliver a profit to supermarkets because people's purchasing of these products at that level diminishes. That's the whole point of it. If the policy fails and people just generally ignore the policy, then the increased price would therefore yield a profit. But if the policy works, then it won't.
The Sheffield Hallam report said that it estimated £120 to £130 million of profit to the retail sector. And I wouldn't have a problem with that if then there was a levy put on the private sector to draw that money back into central government to deal with issues to do with ambulances, police and all the other social costs that we face from binge drinking. But that has never actually been agreed by this government, and it's something that if they were to change their view on that, then I would support them on this measure. But as long as you're putting £120 million a year into the pockets of Tesco's and otherwise, then count me out.
Okay, I think you can I think you can see that this is obviously a very complicated issue, and you'll have seen from the last section on this particular issue on alcohol pricing that Ian has given some indication of Alec Neil's visit to Brussels last week. And what I could suggest is that the committee write to the Cabinet Secretary asking for an update on where he is now with it as far as the EU goes, because again we have to be very careful we're not treading on the toes of our colleagues in the Health Committee who have obviously got a great interest in this policy. So it's worthwhile maybe looking at it from the EU perspective on maybe how the Cabinet Secretary got on in Brussels last week and what the Scottish Government's intention is going forward. Is the committee happy with that? Yeah. Okay, you're happy to send the Brussels Bulletin to all the relevant committees? And I think maybe there's specific ones we should be targeting, obviously justice and equal opportunities and health. Okay?
Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Moving on to agenda item 4, which we have a paper on. We have consideration of the paper from the clerk on the balance of competencies. I think we'll, Ian's going to give us a bit of an insight into that and what it means for this committee, and we'll take some comments and questions afterwards. Ian.
Yes, you will probably be aware that the UK government earlier in the year declared its intention to re-examine the balance of competencies between the UK and between the EU. The purpose being to make sure that the laws are made in the right place, I would argue. This is a very comprehensive approach that the UK government has decided to take, and you'll see that it is going to take 2 full years to do. The important part, I think, is probably in the annex, which sets out all of the areas that will be explored, and it is now every single competence. And as you can appreciate, that is a big task. So the first semester, they're looking at what I would contend are broadly reserved issues. Yes, there was a missing page in that. You've been given one with an extra page. Sorry, that was... Yeah, sorry, that makes more sense. All right. The first semester is broadly reserved matters covering things like internal market, taxation, animal health and so on. But as you go through, you'll find that every single area that the Scottish Government covers is touched upon. So what I'm suggesting, it is a big task. What I'm suggesting, the first thing we do is ask the Scottish Government how it intends to approach this particular issue so we can get a feel for how they intend to do so. We should also, I think, alert the subject committees to this particular review because it will impact upon each of them in very specific ways. And once we get that response from the government, I think we should come back and look at how best to take this matter forward. I mean, just on certain areas, you'll think that fisheries, for example, over the course, there's been a lot of discussion about where the competence for fisheries should lie. Should it be more with Scotland? Should it be more with the EU? There are some areas where, as Hans-Alan Mannach has said, the role of the EU in terms of immigration and asylum might be a stronger competence than the domestic. So there are tensions pooling in both directions, but I think the first stage is to get an appreciation of where the Scottish Government stands on this particular review, and then to decide the best course of action for this committee and for the subject committees.
Okay, I think you can see how comprehensive it is and how detailed a piece of work it could be. Maybe for your understanding, Lord Boswell, who chairs the House of Lords Committee, we had a brief discussion at the last AC UK meeting, and he had some very specific and grave concerns about this process, and hopefully working with our other devolved committees in Wales and Ireland, we will be looking possibly to make a joint submission to the House of Lords Inquiry in order to ensure that the specific devolved nature of different legislation, given that Scots law has always maintained its independence in that respect, is at least recognised, because I think in the initial approach to the balance of competencies from the UK government to Brussels, there wasn't a recognition that actually the law in Scotland is slightly different and therefore needs to be approached differently too. So on that basis, I'll take some comments and questions. Jamie, were you wanting in first, Jim?
Well, just I've noticed now that I was going to say, is it a work in progress? Are we going to get the sort of the results as they come along? Because obviously it's going to take a long time. And I see that it says here that the areas of competence will be published as the review progresses. So presumably we will learn a bit. It'll be like a story with chapters, and we'll look forward to the next instalment, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other comments? Our committee content to write to the Scottish Government seeking an update on their approach, to alert the subject committees to the review of the schedule and its implications, and once we've done that, we can agree to consider our approach. Agreed. Yeah, agreed. Thank you very much. Moving on to agenda item 5, which we agreed to take in private. Oh, yes, Jamie.
The order that this is being done in, the subject order, is that sort of arbitrary, or was it sort of developed over? I see fisheries is quite close to the end, and taxation is right at the front.
They've done. I don't think it will be arbitrary, but I couldn't necessarily tell you why they've done it in this order.
Certainly not in alphabetical order.
It's not alphabetical, that's right, and it's not in terms of the value of the area. It seems that it's set out at the beginning some of the broader, more reserved areas and some of the more important ones. So I think the single market, the internal market is one which is important. Taxation again. There must be a reason, Jamie, but I'm afraid I don't know what it is.
That's right. No.
We can ask.
We can ask, yes, we can.
Okay, happy to move on to agenda item 5, yes, which we agreed to take in private. Can I thank our members of the public and clear the gallery, please? I'll close the formal part of the meeting. Thanks.